I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ugambe and Kumameri traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, for their continuing connection to country, water, and community, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I've been looking forward to speaking to the college for a long time, so thank you, Paul, for the enormous work you've done. I know what a schedule like this takes to pull off, and I'm looking forward to the talks and discussions over the next few days. This is the first time the Teleonome is being presented to a live audience, and my hope is that this talk does two things: puts a clear, useful shape on things you've already been thinking about for a long time, and opens up some new perspectives, concepts, and areas of study that haven't yet been on your radar. As part of my PhD into One Welfare Outcomes of Human-Animal Interactions, in February we published in Frontiers for Animal Science the first of a series of articles, some of which are currently under review. And of course, this is very much a team effort. I could not have chosen a better supervision and mentoring team for my project. My supervisors are Amy Likens, Kath Henschel, and Melanie Filios, and my academic mentors are David Mello and Paul McGreevy. So what to expect from me today? 4 things. First, how it came about, what it is, the 6 A's that operationalize it, and why it matters. This year happens to mark 40 years since Donald Broom was appointed the world's first professor of animal welfare at Cambridge. So it's 40 years of a field going from nothing to a serious science. New journals and new methods, whole specializations that didn't exist before. And yet it seems that progress for individual animals, if it happens at all, is painfully slow. And I'm making these 4, a pig, a dog, a fish, and a bird, my keynote heroes. Across farming, performance, companion, and wild animals alike, some of the most basic, most visible forms of animal suffering are still here, affecting billions of animals year after year. So why? Now, we're very prone to thinking this is a knowledge problem, that we haven't looked hard enough, that there are still research gaps, or that technology will solve things in the future, or that animal guardians need educating. I'm not so convinced. If anything, we've never had so much knowledge, so much specialization and information, so easily accessible by so many. One thing I do know for sure is it's definitely not because people have stopped caring. Everyone here today is here investing time and money none of us have enough of to be here at this conference and in this particular room discussing animal welfare. And it's not just us. The latest survey of public attitudes conducted by Behaviour Works Australia and the Australian Alliance for Animals, which is a repeat of their 2023 study, shows that public support for animal welfare is very strong. The vast majority of people care about animals and how they are treated. And they also want the authorities to do more to improve standards. But yet, here we are. So I'm going to lean on 4 animal heroes and just a few of very well documented welfare issues. We start with tail biting in intensively farmed pigs. Decades of research point to one answer, which is straw or a rooting substrate, yet farmers still reach for tail docking instead. EU legislation says docking shouldn't be routine, and studies keep finding it done on 78 to 99% of pigs. And docking doesn't even solve the problem because pigs go on biting docked tails, and it causes hypersensitivity in the area, so now it hurts more. Or they redirect biting to the ears. And then the whole issue of pain relief or lack of it at docking time. Then we have dog hypertypes, bred for extreme phenotypes. Brachycephalic dogs live years less than their longer muzzled counterparts, a median of around 8 years, but only 4.5 for pugs against 12. Airway obstruction, dental crowding, impaired heat regulation, and obesity as direct consequences of the skull shape they were bred for. The science keeps confirming this while the market moves the opposite way. Registration data across multiple countries show flat-faced breeds becoming more popular over time. Wild salmon are one of the animal world's great feats of memory and will. They imprint on the exact chemistry of the river they were born in, migrate to the sea, and years later fight their way back against the current to spawn in that same water. We hold that same animal motionless in a cage instead, by the tens of thousands. Over a seabed it slowly buries in its own waste. The ones that escape inbreed with wild salmon, producing genetic integration. The wild population absorbs genes selected for fast growth in captivity at the cost of fitness and survival traits wild salmon need in open water. And the last of my heroes is one of the least thought about. We hear a bit about the plight of meat chickens, artificially selected for extremely fast growth and weight gain. These birds live very short, very miserable lives, but we rarely hear about the birds they come from, the broiler breeders who have to be severely feed restricted to prevent health and fertility problems for life. Moves like the recent RSPCA certification standards, including slower growth strains, are important, but they still depend on voluntary participation and consumer engagement campaigns. So we are failing these 4 animals alongside others, not because anyone decided a pig shouldn't root, a dog shouldn't breathe freely, a salmon shouldn't migrate, or a broiler breeder should always be hungry. What's actually happening is quieter and harder to fix than a knowledge gap. Every system built around commercializing the lives and deaths of animals generates problems of its own. Practical ones, like disease, injury, dependency, and cost, and moral ones, because we're building these systems, and the grief of watching animals struggle pulls us to help wherever we can, and to celebrate every hint of a step, however small, tenuous, or far away in the future, any animals will actually feel any benefit. The scale of problems is very large, despite public expectation that more should be done. I certainly find it overwhelming. Psychologists and social scientists talk about cognitive dissonance, a very human capacity to act in ways that contradict our own values and ideals. Dissonance is a very unpleasant mental state. It causes guilt, shame, self-loathing, and humans have evolved strategies to survive it. One of them is dissociation, another is normalizing. There's a whole toolkit, what the psychologist Bandura termed moral disengagement strategies. And unless you're a psychopath, moral disengagement can happen unintentionally when we are overwhelmed and we have to triage between a whole bunch of pretty bad choices. I find myself there. And it's not just me experiencing dissonance. The same people who were surveyed and want authorities to do more dissociate too. We support the very systems we're concerned about. It's not hypocrisy, it's the same survival strategy at a societal scale. And there's a growing literature showing that it blocks progress. We're not seriously dealing with animal welfare, but also climate change, mass extinctions, loss of forests, and now the race to develop artificial superintelligence, knowing it could make things much worse, much faster. So, if we're already overwhelmed and in a type of cognitive survival mode, what, if anything, more can we do? It's a million-dollar question, but there is an old Platonic idea that you don't teach, you remind. And I hope I've been doing that as the editor of Horses and People. I spent 15 years reminding horse owners to see the world from the horse's perspective. If we want to resist the normalizing and desensitizing currents, we need to remind ourselves and others often. And since most people already care, finding more and new ways to remind them could be more powerful than we think. The late Bernard Rollin, the father of veterinary ethics, spent his life reminding people of that. He used a pig, a dog, a fish, and a bird to make an ethical but common sense point land. And his memes, the pigness of the pig, the dogness of the dog, fish gotta swim, birds gotta fly, do the reminding job better than anyone can. Starting in the late 70s, Rollin realized that we never lift the legal and moral status of animals by arguing only about pleasure and pain facts. And I think he was right. It's 14 years since the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, and plenty of the institutions regulating animal systems are still reluctant to say animal sentience out loud, let alone build policy as if it were true, as my 4 heroes reveal. Rollin realized that we ground human rights in the essential features of being human, on human nature, that we are speaking beings, believing beings, property-owning beings, tribal beings, and so on. And Rollin also knew that people don't need convincing, they just need reminding that there's an essence to every kind of animal too, what he called a telos, a pigness to a pig and a dogness to a dog. People also know that each animal stops making sense when you remove the environment that enables them to express it. However, this concept of telos, while being widely recognized in philosophy and bioethics, hasn't really been exploited in veterinary and animal welfare sciences. I first heard it after one of those questions that change you. Can't remember when, maybe 8 or 10 years ago. Thank you again, Paul. Paul asked if I knew the term. I didn't, so I looked it up, and here I am. Telos is a Greek word that literally means end, goal, or purpose. Beyond Rollin's bioethics, the telos principle is applied in biology. It's about understanding living systems by considering form, function, and ecology, by asking what is it for, and by extension, what enables or impairs its function. And of course, the key is answering from the animals, not the human's perspective. In other words, when we look at the pig's snout, pig snout soup is not what it is for. The telos of the snout is rooting, and the whole pig's anatomy, physiology, behavior, and cognition and ecology evolved around this superpower. Of course, as veterinarians, animal welfare scientists, and practitioners, we already reason this way. Every time we look at a joint, a heart, or a digestive system, and we ask whether it is functioning the way a joint, a heart, or a digestive system are meant to function, we are applying this principle. And more generally, we are leaning on evolutionary biology and the functional concept of fit for purpose. But my literature review led me to discover that this way of reasoning already has a formal name. It's called teleonomy. Colin Pittendrick coined this term in 1958 to name something that biologists already recognized, that the activities of living things are goal or telos directed. They are organized around the goals of staying alive by adapting to circumstances and reproducing successfully, passing down these capabilities to the next generation. You may or may not have heard a similar sounding word before, teleology or teleology. It has been in place since Aristotle's times, but it is tainted by notions of externally imposed purpose, that there's an external force or intelligent design behind the structure and function of living things. Teleonomy was coined to break that association. It says that purposeful action, the one that drives survival and reproduction, is intrinsic, built into the organism itself and all its moving parts, and a product of evolution by natural selection. And we see purposefulness in animals when from birth they strive to stay alive and engage with the world in adaptive ways. So when I consider telos and teleonomy together, alongside the lack of progress for animals, something didn't sit right for me. So the term itself, telos, literally names the goal, but not the biological system that pursues that goal. The telos to stay alive and reproduce is a universal biological imperative that applies to all living beings, but Rollin wasn't describing something universal, he was describing something specific to each kind of animal. So I wondered if anyone had already arrived at the teleonome as the term to capture that whole agentic package of anatomy, physiology, behavior, cognition, through which each kind of animal actually pursues that universal imperative. Like the genome, proteome, or microbiome, the teleonome is the right kind of term, and because it is scientifically more precise, I think it can do a lot more empirical work than Rollin's telos. Because I wondered if the very thing that made Rollin's telos so rhetorically powerful, that intuitive appeal to universal ethics, was also limiting its application in science. For many people who sat with telos a bit longer, many of those were animal welfare scientists, it opened up a lot of very, very good questions, like just because something's good, just because something's natural or evolved, does that make it good? Just because an animal wants something, does that mean it needs it? How would we even really know what's going on in their heads? And does artificial selection fundamentally change the animal's nature? These are serious questions, and they've driven real specialization and advanced knowledge in very different fields of thought. But I had another question, whether welfare scientists are now so specialized and so siloed that we forget how the pieces work together, how to assemble the animal again and see the evolved, sentient, integrated biological whole. Another way of arriving at this is asking whether specialization is one of the systemic currents that sweep us away from the very animals that brought us here. Now, we know that welfare assessment is complex. Just like the safety of this building we're in today cannot be measured with a tape, welfare has to be inferred from a broad range of indicators. We now have a wide range of indicators to choose from, but the question is always going to be which ones give us the best peek inside the animal's mind. And if we remember to place the animal at the center, which ones are meaningful from their perspective. So the Teleonome is meant to guide that type of animal-centered welfare assessment processes. It can be operationalized in research and practice. And we have 2 follow-up papers currently under review, one proposing a welfare assessment process, the Teleonome as a welfare inference mechanism, and another applying this approach to examine the welfare costs of extreme phenotypes, which is co-authored by 2 giants in dog welfare, Dan O'Neill and Rowena Packer, neither of whom helped develop the theory but have picked it up and are running with it. So in this next section, I'm going to present the 6 A's that operationalize it: Ancestry, Adaptation, Affordances, Affect, Allostatic load, and finally agency. The Teleonome's hypothesis is that holding all of these in view at the time of making the welfare inference is the key to really understanding what matters to an animal in this moment, as well as the welfare trajectory it is on. These concepts would, of course, be familiar to many of you. They are, after all, the sources of welfare indicators. However, bear with me as I will be interpreting them in relation to our focal animal's teleonome, whether it's a pig, the dog, the salmon, or the broiler chicken, to ensure that the teleonomic principle remains explicit at every step. So let's start with ancestry. Ancestry refers to what's dictated by the animal's heredity and ecology. For animal welfare assessment, it sets a baseline, the foundational knowledge that is required before we can notice deviations from the normal. When considering an animal, the Teleonome proposes that their heredity should be explicitly considered on 4 different levels. First, the species level. These are the traits and capabilities that are species typical. It's what makes a dog and not a chicken or a salmon. We can then dig down a level into stable subpopulations within the species, ecotypes, subspecies, breeds, strains. Here you see herding types. Dogs selectively refined over generations for a particular kind of work. So they have the same species level teleonome, but adjusted in ways that affect what they pay attention to, what they find rewarding, and how they go about it. Then the individual level, because no 2 offspring are ever identical to their parents. Variation isn't a flaw in the gene copying process. As the evolutionary biologist Dennis Noble says, variation is the whole point of reproduction. It's how a species keeps adapting generation to generation rather than just replicating itself unchanged. So every individual inherits a unique configuration, genetic recombination, and epigenetic marks that's theirs alone. So it's this dog. And finally, the express teleonome, this dog right now, because adaptation happens on 2 timescales, evolutionary and lifetime. This dog is a variation of its parents, but will keep changing as they develop, as they experience, as they age. And what you're looking at in any individual animal at any moment is the current expression of all 4 of these levels at once. To operationalize the animal in the moment, you should consider the life stage and sex, the physical capacity now, the learning history, the context, of course, the allostatic load, one of the A's that I'll unpack later, and the mental state. None of these are inherited, they're layered on top of the phenotype and may trigger epigenetic effects and other changes, physiological, attentional, motivational, in real time. So the puppy, the young adult, the senescent dogs are the same animal behaving and coping with change differently at different stages of life. The second A is within lifetime adaptation. This is a plastic ontogenetic capacity to calibrate form and function as conditions change. It happens in response to environmental and life stage pressures. Adaptation has limits, and it can go either way. It can be adaptive or maladaptive. It carries risk. As we know, to remain viable, which is the teleonomic goal, the telos, living systems have to maintain relatively constant internal conditions against a changing environment. Cellular homeostasis is, of course, this process in its most basic form, and it is the most efficient physiological survival mechanism. It can be understood as a regulatory cycle that is triggered by actual or anticipated deviation from an operational range, like a comfort zone. It's a nested principle that operates at multiple levels of teleonomic organization simultaneously: cellular, intracellular, tissue, organ system, and the whole organism in its environment. So a liver cell maintaining its own ionic balance, the liver as an organ maintaining blood glucose buffering, and the whole animal maintaining cool body temperature are all homeostatic processes operating at different scales in a coordinated manner. But holding things steady isn't always enough. At times of increased demand, the teleonome may need to find a new operational range. It adjusts the set points to suit, and this is known as allostasis. In many cases, allostasis is both predictable and manageable: a new life stage, a season, pregnancy, lactation. Take glucose buffering in the liver. Outside pregnancy, it holds blood glucose within a fairly narrow range, but pregnancy brings a steady new demand, a growing fetus, so the whole system recalibrates. Insulin sensitivity drops, more glucose stays in circulation, and the liver's output shifts to match. This is a new temporary normal where the system moves the goalposts, sets a new operational range better suited to the new demand. And when demand decreases, it can shift back to the original homeostatic range. Our salmon hero is an incredible example of lifetime adaptation that's triggered by life stage. Smolting events that prepare their physiology for living in salt water and later allow them to return to fresh water to spawn. We move on to affordances, and in 1977, Gibson defined affordances as the action possibilities an environment makes available to an animal. They're not properties of the environment alone, but properties of the fit between environment and animal. So a branch affords perching to a bird, but not a fish. In welfare assessment, we've been circling around affordances for years, mostly using other names: resources, provisions, environmental enrichment, or environment-based welfare indicators. And it's very much a live conversation. Kat Littlewood and her colleagues, Kat is one of our Animal Welfare Chapter Fellows, has just published on provisions, pushing these ideas forward. From a teleonomic perspective, homeostasis and allostasis aren't purely autonomic background processes, because at times an animal has to do something, engage with the world, in order to regulate itself. They have to seek shade, forage, retreat, affiliate. That doing requires a physical and social environment to afford that action. This means that physiological regulation and behavioral engagement with affordances are two aspects of the same process and not separate systems. So we've talked about affordances as what the environment offers. Well, affect is the felt signal that governs whether the animal engages with them. The teleonome draws on the human affectome that treats affect as a dynamic signal of whether adaptation is trending in a positive or negative direction. This understanding is compatible with Mendel and colleagues' dimensions of core affect, where valence, positive or negative, sets direction, approach or avoid, and arousal gives valence and intensity, signaling how urgently or persistently the system needs to act. In our paper, we've conceptualized this as the DEFA plus U cycle. It stands for Detect, Evaluate, Forecast, Respond, and Update. The autonomic processes I described earlier rely on cells anticipating or detecting a deviation and choosing the right corrective action, and they operate internally without organismal awareness. Following from the human affectome, subjective experience evolved to motivate and govern behavior. Negative affect signals a homeostatic deviation that requires behavioral engagement to be corrected. It motivates action and directs attention to accessible teleonomic affordances. The experiential valence will begin to shift to positive when the animal can forecast or predict an action that will resolve the demand. We recognize that as positive anticipation, and the positive experience will persist to maintain engagement while resolution proceeds. Using the thermoregulation of the pig as the hero, thermoregulatory processes are operating continuously in the background without the pig's awareness, but sometimes a form of action is necessary to prevent overheating, whether it's a change of posture or moving to shelter or a cool place. So the cycle goes like this. The temperature rise is detected and evaluated as a viability threat. It motivates action, which directs attention to finding a cool spot. The valence shifts to positive as the pig identifies an affordance, a wallow, that is accessible. The positive affect keeps the pig wallowing until thermoregulation has been achieved, at which point the experience wanes, releasing cognitive and behavioral capacity to attend to another competing demand, say feeding. In theory, the successful outcome will be stored in the pig's memory and calibrate future activities. In practice, it's a bit more complicated than that, and Kath will be talking about this more in depth. This is the ideal scenario from the teleonome's perspective. But the pig that is confined to a pen has fewer thermoregulatory options, and none that match a pig's evolutionary history. His body detects and evaluates the threat to viability. The negative affect arises to motivate engagement, but the teleonomic affordances that the teleonome expects will be available are not there. All the time the teleonomic goal, which is to stabilize core temperature, is not achieved, the regulatory demand is there, and the negative affect will persist to focus the animal's attention and effort into resolving it. If this situation persists, the teleonome might deploy other thermoregulation strategies, redirecting resources from other systems, as well as eroding the motivation to engage in active responses, the trajectory toward learned helplessness. These four facets of the teleonome are integral to how animals pursue telos. They help explain what an animal is trying to do and why it matters to them. They are therefore integral to assessing the experiences, the mental state of animals at any given moment, which makes this approach compatible with the 5 domains model for welfare assessment. However, there is another aid to add to the picture, and that's allostatic load. Allostatic load is the biological cost of allostasis. So these are the resources and regulatory effort spent in shifting and managing increased or chronically elevated demand. And it reflects the cumulative effects of stressful experiences that may lead to disease over time. It's very well developed in human medicine, focusing on physiological biomarkers like blood pressure, inflammatory markers, metabolic indices, and there is work underway to apply it in animals. Allostatic overload is what happens when the costs of attempting to meet regulatory demand outstrip the system's capacity. Landis and colleagues conceptualize it in energetic terms, where EG is the energy gained from the environment, and you can think of it as in affordances terms. And ECR is EG plus internal reserves, but minus whatever constraints limits access to those affordances and usable energy. EE is the resting metabolic demand, and EI is the added cost of routine daily activity. So together, the lower threshold is what the animal needs to spend just to get through an ordinary day. The upper threshold is what it has to spend it with. And they distinguish between two types. Type 1 overload is what happens when demand is great and resources genuinely run short. So this is a system pushed past what it can currently supply, and it may trigger an emergency life history event. And type 2 is different and insidious. It's overload without a complete resource shortfall. The mediators stay chronically active regardless of actual need, so the cost compounds even though the animal survives and functions, at least for now. Our broiler breeder reveals the lethality of fast accumulation of allostatic load. Fed at the same rate as their progeny, a broiler breeder would not survive the consequences of obesity long enough to reproduce. However, in many animal systems, the strain of allostatic load buildup remains invisible to observers because the animals are culled before the problems become obvious. And that's what we see in the brachycephalic dog, how fast the allostatic load cascades and compounds. While in the comparator breed, the load stays manageable and only climbs late in life, the brachydog starts handicapped. The strain on the system is high from the outset and increases as the puppy becomes active. Surgery helps, but it doesn't return the dog to a safe zone. It doesn't come down to where the comparator is. Being in type 2 overload all its life means that any additional challenge, a hot day, an illness, a stressful event can tip the system over. Examined under a teleonomic lens, the data reveals that the welfare harms of brachycephaly are not simply clusters of breed-associated disorders. They are manifestations of systemic disruption of evolved biological functions. They precipitate suffering and they limit the opportunities for positive affect and longevity. Allostatic load isn't only physiological. Behavior and learning cost something too, so the teleonome keeps the same account for them. Take learned helplessness or tonic immobility. From a teleonomic perspective, these aren't passive states. They reflect a teleonome that can no longer forecast, can no longer believe that any response will resolve the demand. So it shuts behavior down to save what's left. And often, this is the most adaptive response. But this is where the defer plus U cycle earns its keep, because the cycle is a record, it's a history of regulation, and also a history of learning. So an animal that stops responding to a repeated stimulus tells you almost nothing on its own, because two opposite histories produced exactly the same result. But in habituation, the history is one of resolution. Detect and evaluate keep running, update keeps confirming there's no threat, and the prior downgrades the value of the stimulus. Stop responding here is an accurate prediction, and every cycle that confirms it strengthens a sense of predictability and control in the animal. In learned helplessness, however, the history is one of repeated failure. The demand was never resolved, so uptake never had a success to revise on. Stop responding here reflects the opposite lesson, that responding changes nothing. This is an expectation of no control. So you have same response, but opposite effective outcomes. So now we have 5 A's held in view, and in the article currently under review, we propose that together they can serve to operationalize agency. In welfare science, agency is usually defined as voluntary, self-generated, goal-directed behavior. But voluntary smuggles in questions we struggle to answer, like, does the animal really choose? Or is there such a thing as free will? Teleonomy already treats living beings as agents, and agency as functional, and it needs three things to line up. First, the animal needs the action in its repertoire. Has to be a response the animal can call on. It needs the capacity and motivation to perform it, so a body and a mindset that can actually deliver it. And it needs the affordance, an environment, physical or social, that offers the chance. Agency is present when all three hold, and it fails when any one is missing. No action, no capacity, or no opportunity. So a teleonomic account of the welfare of tail-biting pigs fails on all 6 A's, because this rooting trait is what the pig's pigness is all about, but it is systematically foreclosed by the environment. With a pig, you can fix the environment to resolve the tail biting because the teleonome is intact, but the brachycephalic dog's teleonome is structurally in tatters. Air and comforting affordances may be all around, but the body can't use them, and even surgery can't return the dog to a normal dog's trajectory and a happy, playful doggy life. The teleonomic approach reveals a critical affordance mismatch that guardians cannot fix however hard they try. And remember the wild salmon imprinting on its native river and years later fighting the current back to spawn in it? The salmon's teleonome clearly doesn't have a single setting. It shifts by life stage. Cage-imposed crowding may pass as a notional shoaling checklist and still fails the fish because the teleonome needs somewhere to go, and that never resolves. Now to the broiler breeder, and this is a teleonome at war with itself. Appetite and metabolism are working exactly as they were selected for, but the bird is pulled apart into a conflict that added bulk and appetite suppressants haven't been able to fix. The deep integration of body systems relocates the load elsewhere, very much like tail docking only relocates the bites. So there we have it. In the pig, the affordance is absent. In the brachydog, the affordance is present, but the body can't use it. In the farmed salmons, the affordance, shoaling in water, is present, but it is wrong. And in the chicken, an affordance recognized by the teleonome as survival critical must be severely withheld to keep it alive long enough to meet productivity goals. Now, what I've found most helpful about a teleonomic approach to welfare assessment is to consider the affordances against what the animal's teleonome is demanding in regulatory terms. And what I'm doing is applying the teleonomic principle in the same way as the precautionary principle. Assume that if the animal is trying to do something, it is because the teleonome needs it done until shown otherwise. This is a view compatible with Marion Dawkins' motivation and consumer demand work, and what an animal will work for tells you what it needs tradition. But the next step matters. Estimated what an affordance gap or mismatch costs the animal now and what type of welfare or effective trajectory they are in. The effective trajectory is where an animal's welfare is heading. So welfare is not about the balance of positive and negative moments, but whether bioregulatory challenges are consistently resolving, building teleonomic competence and an optimistic perception of agency and control over outcomes, or chronically failing and foreclosing both, eroding resolution capacity and the expectation of control. Positive and negative affective states are not a common currency. They are functionally and qualitatively different, and they should not be added up to produce a welfare score, as David Mello has so often reminded us. Co-occurring positive experiences may provide a temporary distraction, but they do not discharge the underlying demand generating the negative affect. And as the brachydogs so clearly reveal, unresolved demand precipitates suffering, and that limits opportunities for positive affect and longevity. And this is where I want to say something about coping. Coping is a term we reach for whenever an animal survives a bioregulatory challenge, But survival is not welfare, and the allostatic buildup strains the system, reducing quality of life. Teleonomically, an effective response achieves local resolution of a particular demand. The cycle closes, the negative valence discharges. A prolonged, unresolved challenge never discharges that valence. It accumulates allostatic load and the build-up compounds. Our 4 heroes cope until they don't. The tipping point can be sudden and lethal, but the build-up period is unpleasant by design. Negative experiences motivate corrective action. So without confirming that local bioregulatory challenges are actually resolving, coping is insufficient as a welfare descriptor. An effective trajectory that includes allostatic load estimation is more meaningful to the animal. This means none of our examples should be considered acceptable husbandry and breeding practices. So what does the Teleonome ask of us? Not that you adopt a new framework. Almost nothing about our 4 heroes is new. Right at the start, I said you don't teach people why we need to put the animal at the center of welfare assessment. You remind them. Those of us using the Teleonome are treating it as a North Star, the reminding made systematic. The systems with their powerful currents will keep sweeping us away from the individual animals. Normalization and dissociation are the default settings. You can spot it in remarks like, he's not too bad for a bulldog, and also in the disengagement we mark it as suitable for apartment living. When the crowded conditions are explained as mimicking a shoal, or when a husbandry standard becomes acceptable because it keeps a bird productive despite being always hungry. None of these are signs that we've stopped caring. We just forgot, again, to really see the evolved, sentient, integrated biological agent in front of us. We found that holding up the 6 A's can help resist that. So today and for the rest of the week, you will hear a lot of excellent talks, and most won't mention the Teleonome, the teleonomic principle, or all the 6 A's. And that's completely fine, except that when a speaker talks about the species' evolved needs, that's ancestry. If one mentions plasticity and its limits, that's adaptation. If it's enrichment, housing, or resources, they're describing affordances. If they're talking about stress biomarkers, cumulative burden, that's allostatic load. And if they're talking about motivation, control, or helplessness, that's agency. And whenever someone asks not just how an animal is, but where it's heading, that's the effective trajectory. So watch out for the teleonomic principle implied in the concepts or sitting inside the data. The Teleonome is compatible with most of them, but it may change the questions we ask. And my question is, why not make them explicit? Thank you.